Hey, greetings. Welcome to the third episode of Three Friends Who Hate Each Other. My name is David. With me is Adam and Josh. This episode is Religion in Politics, which seemed like a natural evolution from the first two episodes that we did already, dissecting religion in various forms and manifestations. Thank you for joining us. And the last thing I'm going to add is if you want to reach out with questions, criticisms, etc., you can email us at the number 3 friends who hate each other at gmail.com. Thanks.
Yeah, so today we are talking about religion and politics, and obviously there's certainly a wide variety of religions out there, including those that are supported by people who are politically active, or whether that be politicians or simply citizens themselves. But I think our big picture will really be looking at the coalition, if you will, of Christianity and politics. Maybe is there a line? Where is that line? Is it even distinguishable between one and the other? So really starting off with the first question, this is probably the broadest one, is what are the goals of a religious person projecting their views into politics? So essentially, why would someone use a religious belief specifically in promoting or trying to maybe grow their political base or something like that. So essentially, what would be the goal of a religious person in projecting their beliefs into politics? Okay, so I'll open it up to you two.
Sure.
Want me to go first?
Yeah.
Do it.
Okay. So, good evening, guys. I hope everyone's doing well on this fine Saturday in Michigan.
Don't tell them information about us.
Yeah, South. Oh, yeah. Well, Dave, you're not in Michigan. You're in suburbs of Chicago. So, sorry, I take that back. So, when I was kind of thinking about this question, all I could really come to terms with was people hate change and they like things that are like themselves. So cultures form, people groups form. And I think one of the main reasons people project their religious views into politics is to get what they believe about the world and other humans and God and morality, especially ethics, to get that to be the norm in their family, in their community, in their society, and in their country. So I think that's one of the main reasons that, and people use religion because obviously we'll probably get into this more later, but if you say your ideas are backed by a divine source, then that should hold some weight. If I say God wants things to be this way, then that's my reason for believing it. That's my reason why you guys should believe it. But really, maybe ultimately what I want is for things to be how I want them to be, and for others to believe that too. It's just something that struck off the top of my mind. Dave, what do you think?
I mean, I don't think you could be more wrong. Jeez.
Yeah.
I think, yeah, that was the thing. I think I read this two ways, and very much I think what Josh has kind of already talked about is one, I think there's people who want to, I hold this belief, I think it's the right belief. I think the system would be better if this belief was imposed some way or if everyone followed it. And since I can't necessarily always get someone to do it voluntarily, like convert people, if we institute this into politics as a law, then we can sort of by proxy get people to conform to this, and that's better. So I think there's often that. But even just from a more abstract way, like we were just talking before we started this, but religious beliefs are a set of beliefs, and I think everyone projects their beliefs into the world and sort of advocates for them, represents them, and wants those. So whatever those may be, if I show up as a voter, if I show up as an actor in a political sphere, I'm going to still represent those and project those out. And so I can't help that. You can't avoid doing that. And I think religious people do that. So if they're voting for like the Ten Commandments on the courthouse, there is obviously more constitutional legal issues around that, but they're saying like this is good and I think people should abide by that. I think there's like a litany of things that we've seen about that the pros and the cons of that. But I think it's just people usually just saying, this is what I think. I think it's right. And even if you don't realize it, like it should be made so. It should be made so that everyone has to acknowledge its rightness. And that can be something as banal as not projecting their religion, but like Josh said, my religion tells me that this is a moral absolute. And so I want it. And so similarly, people that were supporting like Trump in his immigration policy and putting in people in cages, there were Christians who were saying this is like the opposite of Jesus and the Bible. Both groups are sort of being guided by their beliefs in that system. So, yeah.
Do you think, I was just thinking out that, do you think from a Christian perspective, and though you're no longer a believer, but from your previous life, would you say that, would you think that this is maybe like a cop-out for Christians? Like maybe we don't want to do the hard work of like really maybe trying to be like Jesus or evangelize people, or not even evangelize people, but just come alongside marginalized groups and love them and help them and treat them certain ways. So the next best thing is to get our votes out there or try to change society in this way. But what really ends up happening is it becomes like a shell of what the reality should be. So the reality should be, you know, looking like how Jesus lived. That's the core. But what ends up happening is the shell is that we just sort of vote for 4 or 5 moral ethical changes that we want to happen in our country and make that federal law across the board. I don't know. What do you think about that? Anything?
I think yes to both. I think it's hard to, paint any group with a broad brush. I think there's sections. But
Paint them. I'm just kidding.
I think yes. So I think there's certainly people who are just like apathetically like, whatever, you do it, and I'll vote for that person. Which I think is partly why like politicians always, it's like there's a litmus test of them proving their faith, right? All of them always have to be like God, God, God. So I think that there's certainly an element of that, and I think there could be that element of like cop out, like you do it. I'm not going to go like missionize to people. You should just read the Bible on a public broadcast, that kind of thing. There's something in the notes that I think we'll get to, I hope, but I also think that there's an element of that, what I called like the new Israel, which is this belief that it's supposed to be imbued into our politics now. Like, it's not because they're necessarily lazy. That could be true for some, but I think others are like, we have to be this way. And I think that's a lot of like the moral majority 70s, 80s movement that totally wed those two things. And so now I think we've just been corrupted in how we think about it. So, yeah. Adam.
Good. No, I think I would say that I have like a combination of probably like the two of your views in terms of like the actual goals of a religious person protecting their views. I think I would probably align more so with Josh in the sense that I think that religion very broadly, in a sense, like aside from like personal faith, because I think that that personal faith component is really kind of distinct in just about every religion that I've kind of encountered. The understanding of like you having a personal communication or understanding or whatever with some kind of divine figure, even like separate from Christianity, but like but ultimately like kind of beyond that, the sort of like organized system that essentially, for one, the more people that are like me, understand the world like me, find value in sort of the same things, just simply pragmatically makes things easier. The less things that we can kind of like argue about, the more we can kind of like maybe focus on like the big problems of the world in like kind of this singular view political paradigm. The other thing that I was going to think about, or that I was thinking about while you guys were talking, was that that in nature, having more of a religious order, the more that it's like organized, kind of creates more a system of groupthink rather than critical thinking. And so I think that the notion of having to wrestle with issues or dilemmas, whether they're political, whether they're existential, whatever, I think most people simply don't want to address something like that. Whether that's like an American thing or not, I really don't know, because I've never spent significant time living outside of the country. But I think sort of just like having there's a level to, I think, American consumerism as it sort of coalesced with the religious growth of like the 60s and 70s, of just kind of having everything sort of ordered out, whether it's creating like order and simplicity in the home, and then also kind of in church, where things, it doesn't matter like what like church you go to anywhere in the country. If you're going to like a non-denominational evangelical church, the structure is going to be the same. Mm-hmm. There's going to be announcements. There's going to be 3 songs. You're going to hear about 20 minutes to 40 minutes of a message. There's another song, and then everybody leaves. If you go to a Pentecostal church, there's going to be 4 hours of an altar call after said structure. And so I think that maybe that's kind of part of like a cultural issue of that, in the sense of it's almost like the culture of consumerism being connected with, or almost being synonymous with, an organized religion. And of course, with America, sort of during that cultural touchstone of maybe sort of like the way our culture has been headed since like the 1950s or 60s is so intertwined with evangelical Christianity that I kind of think that the two of them go hand in hand. So it could just be an issue of simplifying every day, simplifying the political system, simplifying everybody's life and understanding. They don't have to understand or encounter or contemplate the world outside them, because all they really care about is what they can see, what they interact with. So there's no like extension or challenging of breaking outside of that bubble. So that was my perception of the goals. It's kind of like coalescing and simplifying everyone's understanding of politics. So for the next question, is it possible for religion to be mixed with politics and have a good outcome? And I'm assuming, well, first, I think that can be kind of like a twofold thing. Is it good for religion to be mixed with politics? And at the same time, is it also good for politics that religion is mixed in as well?
Very good. Go ahead.
Well, I just like the way he broke that apart.
Oh, break it apart one more time for me, please.
So the question is it possible for religion to be mixed with politics and have a good outcome? Okay. But also I kind of think that mixture is sort of like, I'll get into that mixture in a second, because obviously I'm a history teacher and I just simply can't avoid it. But so is it possible for religion to be mixed with politics and have a good outcome? Okay, but then at the same time, this could be sort of a twofold response. Is it good for religion in general to be mixed with politics? So does the intermingling of those two ideas, can it be beneficial to a religion? And then secondly, is it good for politics to have religion intermingled as well? Okay.
Yeah, so I would say if one of those two, either religion or politics, if one of them negatively influences the other, I would say politics definitely has a negative impact on the religion. And of course, my context is in the United States and Christianity. that's what I have the most experience with, and that's what we sort of see and read about and live in our daily lives. I think that Christianity is a unique thing in that it started out as a group of people who lived under a theocracy. Like religion and politics were one unit. You know, Israelites lived under the Mosaic law, and it was their day-to-day reality. And I think once Jesus died and God raised him from the dead, Dave, that
I heard it.
the the identity became, it transcended national boundaries. So one became affiliated with this new movement, a member of God's family through faith in Christ. So Jesus represented all of Israel, now represents all of humanity. So if you trust in that work, we're all a member of God's family and God's kingdom. And what does the nation of God or God's kingdom look like? It looks like self-giving love. And I just think by definition of kingdoms of the world, if you want to grow and be a world influencer, you almost have to not play by those rules. You have to have your nation's interests number one. You have to strategize with other countries against them to try to one-up them, so you become better economically, technologically, whatever the case may be. And when that mindset of power and influence bleeds into Christianity, it's ultimately going to get, it's going to hurt Christianity, because the Christianity is going to look more like it does now that we see with a lot of conservative right-wing Christians, where you just see that mold of conservative politics in America just take over that mold of Christianity. And people who are from the outside looking in, they don't see a difference between a follower of Christ and a Republican, basically, so I would say, at least in that regard, politics definitely hurts religion more. But I do think politics can benefit from religion, but we'll do that on the next little question. So that's it.
All right. So Dave, what do you think?
I mean, I definitely think that religion probably gets the short end of the stick in that trade. I think that it's more easily corrosive and corroded and like corrupted by a political entanglement. Yeah, I think just because I think so. Religion, when we're talking about religion, it's just an organized system, right? Because otherwise, everyone has their own little personal spiritual faith, but collectively we practice a religion. And so there is already an element of like organization behind that, and there are organizations of religion. So it already has that sort of like bureaucratic system, but I think that I think the biggest thing is that when you marry it to this construct around power, which politics has, that's when it really starts getting corroded. And I think that's very much like the moral majority movement of trying to do those things. So, yeah, I think it's bad for religion to be tied to politics for a myriad of reasons. One of the things I was thinking about, something in Josh, something you said made me think about it, and we don't have to spend a lot of time because it's kind of a tangent, but like, oh, so like Israel having this theocratic system, which seemed fine, but like, yeah, they did that when like a lot of systems were theocratic. Like a lot of states were already doing that. And I think now, and this is how we can get our clicks, because I'll say something bad about Israel, but like I don't support the nation of Israel now as an apartheid state that is like trying to impose a theocratic system on two populations practicing two different religions. And so that's where like this thing comes into play and is problematic. As a side note on that, I also saw in this group that I follow that's pro-Palestine that they were really happy that Erdogan won his re-election in Turkey. And I'm like, why? He's a piece of shit. Like, ask the Kurds if they're happy that he won this. Like, this is not good. And it was basically because most Palestinians are Muslim, and he's a Muslim guy who's very like outright about trying to impose a more Muslim state in Turkey. I was like, well, then you're committing like I don't want to do this either or thing, but like you're doing the same problem here by supporting this person. And I just see those as the problem of like trying to push. If when religion gets tied into politics, it becomes this. On the flip side of politics with religion, I think that's a lot more complicated, and I don't know because, again, I think I come back to the point of if politics is representing the people, masses, in any sort of generally democratic republic system, if those people ascribe to religions or other, then like that's going to bleed in. So like politics will have some religion in it, not like I don't want in a theocratic system like structurally baked into it, but it will sort of manifest in various ways. And I think that could be problematic, but yeah, maybe not as much. I don't think that it gets as harmed as religion does tied to politics. Politics somehow, maybe just because the whole thing's so corrupted that it just is immune to that. But
yeah. So I would think, I would kind of agree with you guys. The same with religion in the sense that it kind of automatically gets corrupted. I kind of feel like, well, it's sort of hard for me to separate the idea of religion and faith because like when I use the term faith, I'm talking about like a person's own experience and understanding and knowledge and study or whatever, kind of like what shapes their worldview.
Yeah.
Beyond kind of just their daily observations of the world or whatever. And so I kind of think that religion in the sense of like collective people with like a shared worldview and ethics and morals and all that together would kind of get the short end of the stick because of the fact that that would be used as like a tool of manipulation, using kind of, you're essentially manipulating a person's understanding of the world as a way to get support for something. And there was something, and this might kind of more so relate to what Josh was talking about with like, the nature of like the rules of the political world, like thinking of, you think of probably the greatest living politician that we have right now, or diplomat, would you rather, is Henry Kissinger.
Trump Jr.
The guy's 100 years old, Henry Kissinger. But if there would be one person that so many people would probably like pinpoint as someone, a politician who is so devoid of like right and wrong, you would probably have a lot of people name Henry Kissinger. Now, I see him as a valuable person in terms of like history and understanding like the end of the Cold War in Vietnam, of course, but and also he's just kind of like a fascinating person. But what made him so successful in the political world was viewing things in political terms and not necessarily like moral terms. Like he was probably the person who most clearly understood that a nation's duty isn't to provide a moral compass, but to essentially protect your own interests at any cost. Now, he's not a Hitler Stalin figure, but I mean, supporting the bombing of Laos and Cambodia during the Vietnam War and not really having any problem with it is definitely like still like a controversial issue. So I say that in the sense that like those are sort of like the maxims that clearly show you like the purely political realm. And so if you were to mix something like religion in it, which I feel like the purpose of religion, aside from like whatever outcome like that religion professes, ultimately people engage in religion because of the experience that it gives them while they're alive. And I think probably like the biggest clarity it gives is sort of like a moral outlook or a moral paradigm that they live in with the hope of something else coming in the end. So to kind of mix those two together, one that is almost exclusively based off of an understanding of morality, and the other, which if it works perfectly, is completely devoid of moral. Because with operating with morals limits your ability to protect your country's interests. And so again, like there's always kind of like this dance. And I think that the assumption of a lot of people who believe we need to have more religion in politics are of the understanding that America itself is a religious, specifically a Christian nation, which I don't agree with, and I don't think any like nominal historical person or somebody who studies history would agree with that. Would agree with that outlook as well. And I think that really kind of like this idea of marrying religion as a structure with politics also as a structure is really kind of a huge separation by which the notion of separation of church and state was actually created. It was actually like, again, it's not in the Constitution. A lot of people say it's not, but like the whole phrase separation of church and state came from a letter from Thomas Jefferson that he was writing to a religious group. And the context of the letter was essentially saying like, we need to create this separate, for one, because we don't want to pretend like we're the new Israel, because we all know how that went. Like nobody sees, like we see a country named Israel, but it's in no way connected to, other than geographically, connected to the Israel that's like discussed in the Bible, and archaeologists are still trying to piece together that. But the other thing is that like the whole notion of America, like the foundation of America, like pre-revolution, is essentially a group of religious people that were leaving because of the fact that their political structure, the leader of their political structure was also the leader of their church, and various reasons and problems that came from that. But ultimately, they felt like, oh, we need to have a complete separation from this because of the fact that we don't want someone to dictate what we should believe when their understanding and interpretation of the Bible is different from us. So like that whole notion of kind of marrying them together is like oil and water in comparison to like where America's foundation actually existed at. And of course, like there's a bunch of other rabbit trails that we could go down there from that. But I think that in getting back to like the original thing, is it possible to have it mixed? Like, obviously it's possible, but is it possible to have a good outcome? I don't think it is, because you're either going to try to create some kind of pseudo political structure. Is it based off of compassion? Is it based off of, justice and force? And if we're talking about Christianity specifically, neither one of those systems would work in a political sense. Like, I'm sorry, but like, shouldn't you apply, like, if America is a Christian nation, then shouldn't we have turned the other cheek when Germany sent the Zimmerman note to Mexico during World War I, or like when the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor? Like, shouldn't we like work for reconciliation between recovering, post-Nazis and the Jews? Like, no one was asking for that, and nobody thought that that was the right thing to do. Even Christians that would probably assume those kind of maxims in other kind of social situations. And so it's acceptable to accept those turning the other cheek, forgiving your brothers, 77 times 7 or whatever the number is, in a social isolated setting. But when we're talking about the maxims, the political structures, and the rules of nations interacting together, they're just simply not compatible. And so any other comments on that one?
Real quick, I think Josh had one thing, but yeah, right when you were talking about that, one of the things I thought about, and I think we referenced it before, that I really liked was, I think it's an Reza as a Zealot text, mm-hmm. where he does a lot to sort of he's attempting to disabuse us of this overly spiritualized understanding of some of the things Jesus says. But one of the things that I really like that he talked about is that, like, a lot of times today in that very context, we're like, hey, it's fine for me to turn the other cheek, but like we were attacked, like 9/11 or something, right? And so we have to, or like Nazism is a clear and apparent evil, and I don't think anyone's going to disagree with that. We have to confront that.
Nazis would disagree with that, but
sure, okay. No one's really interested in hearing from them. So
but we don't care about Nazis.
Yeah, exactly. So picking a fight.
even though it might really hamstring a lot of our listener base. Dave just coming out with anti-Israel rhetoric.
We'll have
Disclaimer. Disclaimer at the bottom.
Yeah. Critical of Israel, not Jewish people. But this idea that he talks about that, like, this was like an insanely hot political nightmare going on in Israel at this time when Jesus is saying these things. And what he's saying isn't devoid of political connotations. He's not like an apolitical actor being like, oh, it's all this abstract spiritualism. He's really battling with those things. And I liked that a lot in that sense of understanding that he is trying to tie in like how we act in this way and his faith in these things within a political sphere. And today I think we do that sort of dichotomous, walk about being like, well, I can do this, but as a state we have to this. And he wasn't really always doing those things. And the totality of how accurate all that is, we can debate, but I liked that, the way he sort of heightened the political implication of some of those things. I thought about that when you were talking about him. Josh.
Yeah. Just sort of piggybacking on that, I was going to say the only way I think, well, not the only way, but the way that a religion can positively influence politics, I don't agree that it can mesh. I do agree with the analogy of oil and water, but I think religion can stay itself, true to itself, but impact politics positively. Is if I think it has to be obviously, like, to use a Christian term, it has to be self-giving, it has to be pacifist, and it has to do things behind the scenes that can still benefit the society and the culture and the politics, like schools or hospitals or whatever things Christian organizations might have some credit for. But I think it always has to stay sort of on the margins, and helping from the outside. Whatever will bleed over from what they're doing could positively impact a country and the politics, but it can't be in with the politics. I think it still has to be separate, in order for it to remain true to itself and for people to understand what it is. Because when the religion and politics too get meshed too much, then, like you guys were talking about, you can get things of anything can be justified from a religion. Like we were talking about on one of the episodes about wars being justified on religious reasons. God wants this, God wants that, and then you can pretty much do anything you want, justify anything you want. And once that happens, I think you've lost the religious, I can't really think of the word right now, but you've lost religion and you've lost the politics, in my opinion. So that's just my little tidbit that I thought of when Adam was speaking. So.
All right. Any other comments on that one before we move on to our next point?
I'll save it.
Okay. What?
I'm going to save mine. Go.
Okay. So, all right, moving on to the next part. And I think this kind of we're sort of touching on it or scratching the surface on it to a certain extent, but that kind of brings us to this notion of like Christian nationalism. So I think in a certain way, I think that how we would understand Christian nationalists is kind of going along with some of the descriptions that we've had already, which is sort of like like someone would view themselves as a Christian nationalist would probably view themselves as a religious person using political means to advance that belief religiously. So, and I guess it could be debatable whether their outcomes are best viewed in a religious or a political light, but essentially, like, I think we'll start with the first one, was that do Christian nationalists know that they are Christian nationalists? Or do they have some sort of rationalizing definition for what they are? Okay, so do Christian nationalists, would they know that they are a Christian nationalist? Now, there are some people that um, probably maybe wouldn't use the term Christian nationalist, but as a nationalist, probably their description of that is a shared belief within the culture of a certain area. So would a Christian nationalist know that they're a Christian nationalist? And or would they have some kind of other rationalizing definition for what or who they would be?
This might not be accurate, but this just might be my
I'm gonna be dead wrong about this, but I'm gonna go
biased
on.
opinion. I don't know if I think Christian nationalists know they're nationalists. I just don't think they know. I just don't think they are Christian in the sense that they. I think a Christian nationalist, in my opinion, is someone who is like culturally Christian, but I think that might be more like, we believe in God. We want the Ten Commandments up. We have some vague Judeo-Christian ethic that was taught to us by somebody. I go to church. I mean, not that church has anything to do with it, but I just mean like we go on Easter and Christmas. But what they really are for is they're really for their country being the biggest, the strongest, the baddest, the toughest, the top dog in the world. And I think that the Christian part just kind of gets tagged along as another thing to sort of legitimize it and to, like you said, Adam, to bring people together. What can I take from society and culture that people believe that's a strong force to back this movement? And of course, it's going to be, it's God, our shared belief in God, life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, God, that's my take on it. So I don't know. That's just first thing that popped in my head.
I think, yeah, not exclusively. I think a lot of them,
correct. Yeah.
I think a lot of them would say that they are Christian nationalists. I do think probably a majority, like Josh was saying, I think would say like, yeah, I'm nationalist, I'm pro-America. They may not like actually self-categorize within that, but I think they would be. So I'd say probably most would probably cleave to the nationalist part. I think Trump talked about like, I'm a nationalist, that should be a good thing. And I think he was trying to resuscitate that sort of ideology. And I know there's like three politicians, Marjorie Taylor Greene, I think is one of them, that has identified as like, I'm a Christian nationalist, that should be a good thing. But although it's, I think, growing, I don't think a majority would say Christian nationalist. I think they'd say I'm America first and I'm, pro this nation. So yeah, I'm a nationalist. But I think that they would be advocating for this sort of specific manifestation of a political realm that is basically that. The interesting point that Josh said that is probably for another time that I really want to unpack is, it sounded like you were saying, but they weren't real Christians. And I do get the fact that there are probably those that are culturally Christian in that they've grown up in the milieu of a political sort of conservative evangelical movement. And so these all seem as one. So to say I'm conservative is the same as say I'm Christian, etc. But like, I don't think I could question or call into critique with the authenticity of their faith. Like, my personal belief is I don't think you can tell anyone who says I'm this that they're not. I don't think anyone's wrong in those things. So I think maybe you could sort of like with a theological like test, you could show like, well, you don't really understand the things that you think you're announcing. But I think if they say like, well, I'm a Christian, then they are. And if they're like, I'm a Christian nationalist effectively, then yeah, they are.
Yeah, I think that gets into semantics. Unfortunately, I think, in America, especially in Western Protestantism, you can have literally thousands of definitions of what Christians are and what they believe and don't believe or should be and shouldn't be. Yeah. So that is obviously problematic. It's easier to define someone who's like Catholic or Orthodox. There's a structure there. There's things you have to abide by. But when we are talking about evangelicalism in American politics, maybe you could say no one is a Christian because there is no definition of what being a Christian really is. So if a Christian is anything, then a Christian is like nothing type of thing. So I don't know. But,
Yeah. Wow.
wow, cool. Did you
Can't
do
imagine
that
why
on
you're
a
not a youth pastor anymore.
Hey-o!
Anyways, kids, let's go play dodgeball.
No, I mean, like, I only make that joke because that's like 100% true. I mean, like, think of like the number of churches that like we were familiar with growing up and how they've kind of shifted their branding to being like a non-denominational church.
Yeah.
Like the structure, tone, you're still Baptist. Like, I don't care if you have a bass guitar up there. Like, you're still Baptist. You don't want people dancing, and you're probably not going to want to encourage the youth group to have like a card tournament at like you know, that's just, you know. So
Communion.
Like, I was listening to some things about, there's a documentary from FX about like the whole Hillsong church organization and how ultimately all of that kind of as you know, as popular and as accepting as they branded themselves as, they had close ties to kind of like the conservative Pentecostal, like Australian church. And so on the outside there, you know, come as you are, like dress how you want, be who you want to be. But like a number of people of color or people from the LGBTQ plus community, like all found themselves sort of alienated from that. People who had been involved in, you know, singing or whatever kind of found themselves isolated when they decided to live out what they understood was acceptable, and, you know, bringing their partner to church or whatever. And then suddenly it's like, actually, we don't need you singing anymore. It's like, this is something that you're going to do. So, so it's interesting that you point to that, because like the broader, the more wishy-washy people are in terms of their whatever religious group that they're choosing to belong to, the more we kind of have like so-and-so Bible church or so-and-so just church or whatever, the harder it is to really kind of define what they are. And they want to have the broadest appeal possible, but still kind of maintain those things. So like, I think, Josh, you're like totally right in the sense that we have this term that's like culturally Christian, and sort of to what Dave would say, I think that, because my first question when you mentioned that phrase was like, well, could you define that for me? But like, we all would kind of know some of the things that would go into something like that. But in terms of like having like a genuine articulated definition for that, every one of those people who we would probably say, oh, they're just assuming that they're culturally Christian, would have 1,000 different definitions of what would be included in that. And so I think that for the Christian nationalism, like the definition, I think it's operating under the guise of a person that probably would identify as either a Christian nationalist or a nationalist. I think that they would probably be coming from the assumption that America is a Christian nation, that their zealotry or patriotism for their country is most deeply associated, like up the ladder, or highest connection up the ladder is almost an allegory of their devotion to God. Like, they're willing to sacrifice everything for the country because the country stands for X, Y, and Z. You know, it doesn't stand for necessarily freedom of speech. It stands for maybe my freedom of speech to practice my religion in my predominant culture. And so, like, I'm reading this book, which actually, Dave, it was in one of the articles you sent me about from The Atlantic, I think, that was talking about kind of like the rise of Christian nationalism. I had started reading the guy's book. His name's Paul D. Miller, and he wrote this book, The Religion of American Greatness, What's Wrong with Christian Nationalism. And Miller is actually somebody who he's taught in some pretty prestigious schools. He spent a lot of time within American national intelligence, and he's very open, like in the beginning, that like he's pro-life. He's always been like fiscally conservative, but this is something that kind of for him is troubling, both as a a person of faith, and then also as like an academic, because this is getting thrown around. And he was saying how like the problem with nationalism broadly, and if we've looked at it throughout history, is that it's operating under the assumption that there is like a homogenous group of people that make up a nation. And so nationalism in Japan in the 1700s was really easy because of the fact that like there was zero diversity. Like they had expelled European missionaries and stuff at that point. So like nationalism in other countries isn't necessarily like a troubling or a racist or a bigoted thing because of the fact that those nations have like clearly homogenized ethnic groups, usually like a lot of religious uniformity within that. But America is very different because of the fact that like it was born from diversity. Now, like obviously there's a lot of like white supremacy that goes on when colonization begins. However, the colonizers themselves were, as weird as it sounds, a diverse group of white people. Mm-hmm. And of course, over the years, there's only kind of more and more different cultures that are kind of creating this weird, unique, eventually white Anglo-Saxon and like Protestant idea. But I would actually argue that that's probably not the majority of the population that was a part of that group. It just was that was probably the largest minority group of all the different minorities that would make up America. And so the understanding of nationalism, especially for America, regardless of like Christianity or not, is very problematic because of the fact that our country has never had one single national identity. It's had an identity that was formed by the people in power, but I would argue that they didn't actually make up the population. They were dictating what culture was. I think if you look throughout history and culturally, that culture is sort of dictated by a majority. Even in a place like the Soviet Union, they were very ethnically diverse, but their culture was being shaped by the people who were conforming to a totalitarian state. But like with America, because there's so many other groups of people, even if you just focus on white Protestants, there's white Protestants that are living in cities. There's white Protestants who are coming from Finland and settling in like northern Minnesota. Like it's just, they don't have the same kind of belief system, and they don't have that same kind of belief system as it interacts with a political set. And so it's very vague. And I just kind of feel like today, people that are advocating for Christian nationalism have an understanding of an America that has never existed. And the further you pursue that, I think that the closer you get to a Nazi Germany. And I hate using the term Nazis because they seem so much like James Bond villains that aren't connected to reality. But when you read kind of the stories of those people that made up those groups and the origin in which National Socialism originated in Germany, it's all coming from people who felt like they weren't being heard, that felt like they wanted to have something to believe in and have pride in and show dedication to. And so for the Nazis, like they kind of provided that. Like, we have a reason to be proud of Germany again. We got screwed over in the last war. That's one of our problems, is we were sticking it out for another group of people. We need to focus on us, German-speaking people, German culture. We're under attack. We're being limited. We're being silenced. We're being hamstrung with debt from foreign nations. We need to throw all that stuff off and just focus on us. Because like the Nazi Party started with like firm religious roots, and it only like started to deviate from that in the late 1920s once they started to get a lot of political collateral. So like I think that with Christian nationalists, like, do they view themselves as that? If they want to use the term Christian nationalists, I think probably for those people, they want to overemphasize their connection to Christianity, because I think most people who are nationalist, America first, would most likely be living in this understanding of America as a formally Christian nation. And that's sort of, from a social attack, that's what's at stake, is their faith, and America being the standard of that faith, or standard bearer of that faith. So any other points you guys want to make to that? Questions, comments?
Points. I don't know about points. I would say this, like, while you were saying those things, yeah, I think I thought about, and I had in the notes, but the themes that I see in that is, one, that there's this tendency to start mythologizing American history and its American inception. And then, like, that I talk about, like, they have these new patriarchs, like they need this, like, we're like Israel, right? There was these towering men, Moses, Joshua, you know, that like made us conceive this country through supernatural events, and like they are revered and honored in that way. And like I feel like they start doing that with America too. It can't simply be like a more natural sort of political reaction to other pressures. It was this supernatural moment. And then, yeah, this total lack of understanding. I think they view history as stagnant all the time. It's the same things that like you see on social media where they're like, did you know that like all Democrats were against freeing the slaves? And it's like, you don't know what Democrat and Republican meant back then. Like back then there was like the dominating group was the Whig Party. Like this isn't the same thing. And not besides like not understanding the Southern switch or whatever, but like just viewing everything historically as a stagnant, singular, like linear path and line. In the same way that one of the things I thought about was like going back historically, like, yeah, there's always been marginalized groups that have been like marginalized and oppressed, but that historically, like the idea that like Italians weren't white, that like these groups that we kind of consider now as like, well, no, that's like the way there was this very anti-Irish movement, and obviously like Jewish people have been like treated poorly historically throughout America and hit like sort of a fever pitch right around World War II, in a large part because some of this white supremacist rhetoric was kind of attractive to some folk. But like now we look back as like, no, we heard the Nazis were doing bad things to the Jews, and we showed up and we put some like that wasn't. It was so much more complicated than that, and they want this like very simplistic like narrative about that. And I think they infuse that into like our history. They infuse that into like the conception of America, because then it makes it easier for that pitch. Then it's simply like 1 + 1 is 2, and so I can now sell you on this new thing. And that's an easier way to sort of gloss over the complexity and gloss over that history is not always like that, and that it's not a linear pattern. And then one of the other things when you were talking about that I wrote down was David Barton, which like fits perfectly into this and some of our historical stuff before. And I don't want to give him a platform, but for those unfamiliar, he kind of came up in very right-wing Christian movements as a guy who has like no historical credentials whatsoever, but who very much like falsely is like America was founded by 100% all Christians that advocated for Christianity and wanted America to be Christian. And I think the reason why that fits is because like what you were talking about, Adam, is like when then that makes these sort of modern manifestations, not that they're trying to impose something, but we're trying to get it back. Something was taken, it was broken, and we're trying to like return it to how it should have been.
Yeah, and it's like a factory reset.
Yes, exactly.
It's like a cultural factory reset.
Yes. But they have to convince you that this is how it was to start, and so now we're just returning to what it should have been. I think, yeah, that's the mythology that Dave Barton is really big on. But
yeah, there's actually a really interesting clip. I can't remember who it was. I can't remember if it was Tom Brokaw or the other guy from Nightline. I can't remember Ted Koppel. Anyway, it was shortly after, maybe it was about 2015, 2016. It was somewhere around the 2016 election. And he was just going to do this puff piece about Mayberry. It's like a made up city from the Andy Griffith Show.
Yeah.
And like tons of people go there to see. It's like, I guess like the show is based off of like a fictional city, but there is a city named Mayberry, and it's somewhere in Middle America. And so they've kind of like become a tourist town, tourist trap, or whatever for fans of this show. But what was interesting about it, and like the reason they kind of like did it, were based on these interactions that the anchor was having with people who were like riding this tour bus, because they're just naturally like talking about like different things and stuff. And he was saying how shocked he was how not necessarily like why the show was didn't have a lot of like diverse fans in terms of like color necessarily, but just like simply like outlook and political. Like all these people that he was talking to were all like, well, I mean, I don't like everything Trump says, but I'm going to vote for him, because there's sort of this understanding of like, you know, look where we are. Like, well, this is the way like America like used to be. Like it, you know, you didn't have to lock your doors at night. You know, everybody knew and respected law enforcement and all this kind of stuff. And like what the anchor like pointed out was, you know, this show came out in the late 60s. And like, yeah, it was black and white, and like, yeah, it was like squeaky clean and everything like that. But if you look at this show in the context culturally of that decade of American history, it's like one of the most tumultuous, even more so than World War II in terms of like a cultural realigning or adjustment. And so, but like a lot of the talking points that these people who were interviewed had, they were almost like down the line. Yeah, we just need to go back to this. Like, this is the way that it was. And like, who doesn't want to live in a world where like people feel safe and people feel like connected to their community and all this kind of stuff? But like the anchor like points out at the end that like everybody has said like this is the way it was. This is like, doesn't everyone want to return to that? That's why I'm voting this way, because there's a way of like kind of turning back the clock culturally to when we've like deviated from what was good and what made America and every individual's lives better. And he's saying like they're literally realigning with a worldview or like existence that didn't exist. Like they're almost, it's almost like the Matrix, like where they're being reprogrammed to believe that when they grew up in the late 60s, like that's the world as it was. Now it could have been their neighborhood. I mean, like I grew up in the 80s and 90s in like a suburb of Detroit where like, I mean, like, yeah, we didn't lock our door because like there was no crime where like we were at. Like we knew all our neighbors and all that kind of stuff. But like at the same time, being like having studied history and like read about what life was like, I mean, obviously not just in my city, but 30 minutes down the road in like the crack epidemic and like what's going on in the city of Detroit and like the urban decay and everything like that, that while my experience was maybe like pretty easy and it's like fun to look back from like for nostalgic purposes, that ultimately realigning like my experience doesn't speak for the whole of reality. And I think that in terms of Christian nationalism, it's a really similar thing that they're wanting to do, realigning where like everybody was like religiously focused. And that's just simply a reality that has never existed. But I think maybe it's like due to people's understanding of history or lack thereof, or even in some cases, there's a really good book. If you guys haven't read it, it's a book called Lies My Teacher Told Me by a guy named James Lewin, I believe. I have read it several times because of the fact that I became a history teacher and I don't use textbooks. And his criticism isn't just simply of like, oh, they're kind of like oversimplifying history. That's sort of his overarching nitpick with the nature of like textbooks and curriculum, but also kind of like to in order to the ends of oversimplifying history, deviate kind of into hero worship, where yeah, there's a lot of parallels between finding the founding fathers or a person like Abraham Lincoln and creating them as this unattainable biblical figure. And I think that's kind of like so very telling, because even in the book he talks about how, like, if anybody were to ask, like, okay, like, who has been America's greatest president, if they don't say Washington, they're going to say Abraham Lincoln. Like, there's no like there's no like other option. Like, no one's going to be fighting hard for Grover Cleveland. I don't care. It's just not going to be. This is not going to happen.
Really big on
But I mean, Josh might be sticking it out there for Warren G. Harding. Who knows? But
How dare you?
no, but like, the average person is going to name one of those two people as being America's greatest president.
Yeah.
And really, aside from Washington, Abraham Lincoln never got the majority of the vote. He never had like a popular mandate to rule the country. And I think the question of like, was he our greatest president? That's not irrelevant, and it's not my point. It's just simply like that he was not a popular figure in his time. Like, he 100%, if you read a book called by Doris Kearns Goodwin called Team of Rivals, it's a fantastic book. It's actually so good I almost cried at the end because he was shot, knowing that was going to happen. But it was. What's that?
Spoiler alert.
Spoiler
It
alert?
was sorry, I didn't mean to spoil it out there for you, Josh. But no, they talk about the fact that he, like, during the nomination process, he was sort of like a throwaway candidate. He's like a good moderation because we don't want the South to secede and everything like that. And so when we are turning back the clock to a certain time in which we feel like America was or should be today, it's ultimately not a place that ever existed. So Abraham Lincoln became America's greatest president from posterity, not from contemporaries. And so I think that's kind of getting into our next point, which is kind of like mythologizing some of these people in history and events in our history. And so essentially, I think that we're getting to that point now, or is this problematic, or does it diminish religious text narratives when we coalesce this mytholization of American historical figures and allegorically compare them to biblical figures?
Real quick, because I want Josh to talk. But I mean, I would say, like, yeah, maybe I think so. Simply in this fact of that, I don't know. I think it depends on the purposes of those. I agree. This idea that approaching, I think one of the greatest sins that we do in many cases, including education, is taking really complex issues and topics and then just overly distilling them into very simple formulaic systems, which is where you end up like all this stuff was happening. Then Lincoln like won the Civil War, like alone, Lincoln went out there and did that himself.
Yeah.
And sort of struggling with the complexity of the individual, that Lincoln was definitely a flawed human being, but like, and more of like he was the right person at the right time kind of thing, and guided us through difficult things. But I think it probably belittles religious narratives and figures a little bit, like as cool as Lincoln was and great, like he never performed miracles. He didn't hit a rock and water came out of it. Like he didn't do the plagues of Egypt. So like they're not really on the same level. And I think obviously the narrative purpose for someone like Moses is this is the patriarch of a nation that God intends to create. Like it's hard to live up to that. So yeah, I think it probably does belittle the religious things. And then you're putting this religious spiritual element in text into a very temporal human, like earthly form. Like the America is just like the Bible. Like it's not. And so, yeah, I think it probably abuses that one more. And then just like what we're talking about, then Lincoln becomes more malleable. Then he can become, because there's that movie, I'm trying to remember, like Abraham Lincoln, like Vampire Slayer or something like that, which is like tongue in cheek and fun. But you can become that, because then if the idea we have of, let's say, Abraham Lincoln isn't tied to the actual history of the person, then I can use him for whatever. Then I can pull him and he can become this this trump card that I can utilize in whatever purposes, and it doesn't matter whether he actually was, or for example, like the founding fathers, regardless of their complex views on how to treat black people or whether women should vote or religion and politics and Christianity, like it doesn't matter because now I can just use them as this tool for getting across my purpose, which yeah, again, I think kind of comes back to one of the earlier questions about the issue of religion and politics. But,
Yeah, I think it's kind of like a cultural Rorschach test. Like I heard it said
Yeah.
once about how like your views on Jesus say more about you than they actually do about Jesus. And like I think of like I went to a Christian high school, I went to a Christian college, and I live in a pretty conservative, like mid-sized city. And so I've kind of been so overly churched or preached to in a certain way of making Jesus acceptable to the point where, like, there's things I've heard about, like, oh, yeah, like Jesus wouldn't care if you smoke a cigarette or have a drink or like all this kind of stuff. Like they're trying, and that's neither here nor there. I'm not taking a stance on any of that. It's just saying that, like, there are some people who believe that, like, if Jesus were to see you smoke a cigarette, then he would flip over the tables of the temple. And then there's other people where they would treat it like the 5 loaves and 2 fish. Like, well, you got to share with people that are around. I mean, it's just like there's this cultural Rorschach test, and there's like, because of these figures being so malleable, as you put it, where you can sort of manipulate them, the narrative of their existence, like their narrative history, I feel like, which is kind of so problematic, is that you can shape it to meet your own ends.
mm-hmm.
You can make Jesus a political figure. You can make Jesus a pacifist. You can make Jesus somebody who's assertive and speaks truth to power. Like, you can do all of these things. And rather than saying, like, he was a complex figure who could be all of these things at once, people emphasize what they like the most about that.
Yeah.
I was going to say, as far as Christian nationalism goes, who are the mythical heroes that we have like attached myth to? I mean, because when I think of like Christian nationalism and Christianity and how it affects politics, like all I really think of is either like, I just think of Jesus and like politics. Like, I don't know why, like, I don't think of like Moses or like anyone from the, Judeo version of Judeo-Christianity. And when Adam said, like, you make Jesus who you want to be, like, that is true. And we do make Jesus out to be a myth. But at the same time, all we have to go on about who Jesus is the Bible. And if Christians sort of, made themselves more acquainted with who the text, not the only text, but the more reliable text that we have of who Jesus is, I think it would give people less room to, create this myth around who Jesus is, white Jesus, conservative Jesus, whatever Jesus, instead of making Jesus into our own image. We kind of try to make ourselves like more like him. But I don't know, when I was listening to you guys, I just thought of Republican Jesus, where he's in front of the American flag or whatever, holding the AR-15 and riding a Tyrannosaurus Rex or whatever like that. Unfortunately, that might be the most accurate, or not the most accurate, but the forefront like depiction of Jesus in our culture. Like, I think our culture is so disconnected from what Christianity is or who Jesus might even be, that it's even like far beyond him being a myth. It's more just like, I don't know, I think he's almost like gone into non-existence, but
yeah, there was a really good book that was written by actually the conservative columnist for the New York Times, a guy named Ross Douthat. And the book that he wrote was called Bad Religion. And it was kind of about how Christianity specifically has kind of been corrupted by the religious right, speaking as a political force for so many religious people, to where, like, there's like a person could not be pro-life and against the war in Iraq. Like that was just sort of like a view that didn't really exist. I'm sure people probably did have them somewhere, but like that wasn't a political that wasn't a political subset of any group. It was kind of very clear cut and dry. And it was sort of like the assumption that the religious right is speaking for evangelical Christianity, or really Christianity as a whole in America, and that was very much like, this is the viewpoint. And I think like what you're talking about, Josh, of like, you know, sort of like the cosplay version of like Jesus in America, I think one of the reasons that there isn't a greater understanding of even the biblical Jesus is because of the fact that like to true, I mean, like, not to say that I'm in a position to where I can speak and define what Christianity actually is, as opposed to like everybody else who is claiming that and as their worldview, is the sense that I don't think that anybody, ourselves included, have really wrestled with the understanding that Christianity is a 2,000-year-old religion that was originated in a very specific culture and time period. And so all of the texts come within about 200 years of that time period. And that even though all of us have a Bible and probably have read the Gospels, you know, maybe not consecutively necessarily, but like probably over time, we've probably read all of them all together. But that's not enough to truly understand the context and structure in which like those passages were created.
No, that's true. You would need like a master's level.
Yeah, I mean, so like it really does take work, and I would argue that people are much more willing to accept this Walmart version of Jesus because it's so whittled down to the simplest terms, and it encapsulates. I feel like I'm a conspiracy theorist against like material and consumerism, because I've just seen so much of that sort of like ingrained in the way people interact. Like it's such an American thing. Not to say that like I've spent so much time overseas and so enlightened about things like that, but like I just kind of noticed it in because for the last 3 years I've been teaching kids that are learning English. And so they're coming to me as high school age students from all over the world, from Afghanistan, Central Africa, Central America. And so like there's obviously a ton of diversity in my history classes, but how the kids interact and get along and then develop a common language in English to interact with each other, it's like there's this piece that doesn't view like the teacher as this is some kind of service that I'm paying for. Like some of my other students, I teach another program where like it's alternative ed. The kids are expelled. Their interactions with teachers, even when they're positive interactions, very much come from a consumer and producer type of relationship, like the commercialization of the interaction itself. And so again, I just kind of always have to go back to this. What's that?
Like, and the learning or the teaching is the product?
Yes. Well, a lot of times with my students, obviously it's a very like distinct demographic, so it doesn't speak to American students as a whole. However, I can speak from my experience that the understanding is that I'm here to get a grade. Why isn't my grade this way? Like, this is what I'm here for. So it's sort of like the mentality of, now granted you can throw an entitlement, but it's sort of like this mentality of like, I'm here at this marketplace. Why don't you have this that I want? Like, I want to have a passing grade. Why don't I have that? And like, well, you have to work for it. Like, you have to do these you have to demonstrate these sets of skills and make it repeatable in order to earn credit for this class. But like their understanding a lot of times is like, well, I'm here. I don't understand like why I'm not passing. Oh, I did this maze that you gave me after like I failed a test. Why do I have a failing grade? I solved the maze. Like it's a very much kind of like it's like a commercial type of relationship. And I've seen that ever since I first started teaching. And it doesn't matter like the demographic of the student that I have. If they're an American student, like that's their assumption. That's the paradigm that they think that they're operating in. And I'm not saying that they're necessarily wrong for thinking that. It's just sort of like it's like a cultural thing. And I don't know if it was different, in the 90s or whatever before I was teaching, but it's certainly been my experience for the last, like 12, 13 years of really this kind of like commercial interaction. And so I think it kind of goes to this, speaks to the same way in terms of church. Like it's another component of a cookie cutter, non-surprising existence. Like we have a very easy, digestible understanding of the afterlife. This is the reason why I go to work, why I may give money to my church, why occasionally I pray with my kids at night. Like it's just a cultural thing that we do. And so like it's almost like, I guess in a weird way, it's almost like the SparkNotes version, a SparkNotes understanding of a religion. Like, yeah, you could like read SparkNotes and kind of have like an understanding of the plot. Like you could go to church and have kind of like an understanding of the plot of Christianity, creation, fall, redemption done. But like you're not really going to understand. Like you can't do a SparkNotes version of Crime and Punishment or Les Mis or something like that, because like the story, the narrative itself is so in depth, in detail, that especially in comparing it to Christianity, in order to fully understand the nature of the religion and possibly even its relevance 2,000 years after, takes a lot of work, and it takes a lot of study, and it takes a lot of like critical thinking. And I think that in some ways that's probably what's driven a lot of people in our cohort away from organized evangelical Christianity, is that this is being manipulated, this like this belief set or like need to find truth and comfort in understanding a complex world is being so watered down and commercialized to where it really doesn't have any kind of meaning other than this is something that I do on Sunday.
Yeah. And I think that is true. And I think that if your understanding is a SparkNote version of Christianity, like my only advice would be don't take your SparkNote version of your religion and insert it into politics. Don't go into politics at all. Then just stay with your SparkNotes over there, and don't taint the name of something that's only Spark noted understanding, if that makes sense.
Well, I think we are about out of time. So any other thoughts on that last point?
I have something. Let's see, where did it go?
Is this where you send out a meme, Josh?
2 Chronicles 7:14. I wanted to read that. If my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, then I will hear from heaven and I will forgive their sin and will heal their land. Just want to tell everyone that doesn't apply to America at all in the 21st century. That's was for Israel whenever Chronicles was written. So that's not for us guys out there, our parents who are watching this. Okay. I feel like that's the anthem cry for a lot of well-meaning Christians who are also patriotic. That is sort of their
Well, we know what verse Josh won't be reading on 4th of July.
That's right. That's right. I crossed it out.
I mean, I think there's probably more that we can unpack some of those other things at other points because I mean, I feel like this is a rich topic that there's a lot to do. But yeah, I think one of the things that speaks to is that this really weird, pervasive idea about in the notes I wrote that America is the new Israel, and that somehow they think that there's been this shift of like God basically gave up on the Jews. There's people that for like thousands of years, he was like, "Yep, you're my folk," and then just like switched over to us now. And like Josh, that you were reading, like that the same rules apply. That based on, yeah, and I know Pat Robertson died the other day, and I'm not really missing him, but like that he would talk about that, like there were these I think it was Hurricane Katrina, he said was God's judgment for gay marriage, basically.
Yeah,
That
yeah.
like God will enact things, bad things to happen, that will lose Vietnam or whatever because of the nation's rules. And that imposing this, perfectly Jewish thing that if the Jews enact these laws and they follow the rules and they build the temple exactly as they should and they abide by all of the commandments, then God blesses them. And if we pass laws that are pro God, he'll bless us and we prosper and thrive. And if we pass laws that he doesn't like, then he's like, now you're in trouble. And this like insane, like, yeah, I just do not have any understanding of how that switch happened. Of people who are like that they know Israel exists and the Jews still exist, but God just was like, never mind, and came to here. And I don't understand why they think that those rules would now apply here. But very much like what you're talking about, is like that's when we're talking about this conversation of like religion and politics, especially for that Christian nationalist right-wing evangelicalism, that's their views.
Right.
That's why they're voting for X, Y, and Z because of that thinking. And yeah, it's just so insane to me.
And what I find interesting too is that in the U.S. now, like maybe 50%, less than 50% of people believe in like a personal God or any type of God at all, and then dwindle down that percentage of how many people would consider themselves biblical Christians or whatever you want to define it as, and then that small percentage of people. And then the people who go by this verse expect the country to behave in a certain way in spite of the differing beliefs and lifestyles. And this is also just kind of humorous to me, but another talk for another day, I guess, right?
So let me then, I think, can we end with this? I have a question then. So do you think that that'll ever work? Meaning like, so we're talking about there's this ever increasing minority, and even within like people who identify as Christians and then like biblical Christians and then people who think that's an even smaller subset of the larger umbrella of Christian. So that's a shrinking minority of the total population who are basically trying to politically project their view onto all of us. Like, do you think that that'll work? Do you think that
I mean, no,
or,
I don't think so. I think that America eventually will become like Europe. I mean, America's already post-Christian in a lot of ways, and churches, will continue to get smaller and smaller numbers, and whatever, historical thing is next for us. But I think whatever, like a good gauge is like watching Europe and then seeing what happens with us too. So I guess time will tell. But no, I don't think it'll work. So.
And then Sodom and Gomorrah happens.
Right. Then we all get destroyed. So there you go.